November 24th, 1944, 30,000 feet above Tokyo Bay. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata gripped the control stick of his Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien fighter, eyes widening as he climbed through the thin, freezing air toward what appeared to be an impossible sight. Through the scratched plexiglass of his canopy, silhouetted against the pale morning sun, flew a formation of aircraft so massive they seemed to defy the laws of physics. "What kind of monsters are these?" he breathed into his radio, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and something darker, a creeping sense of dread. The American bombers approaching the Japanese home islands weren't the B-17 seconds or B-24 seconds he'd studied in intelligence briefings. These were something entirely different, something far more terrifying. The lead aircraft alone appeared larger than 3 of his fighters placed wingtip to wingtip. Its silver skin gleamed in the sunlight, 4 massive propellers carving through the stratosphere at an altitude his own aircraft could barely reach. The wings stretched across the sky like the span of a bridge, and beneath that enormous fuselage, Shibata could see the bomb bay doors, cavernous openings that seemed to swallow light itself. "They look pregnant," his wingman, Lieutenant Yamada, remarked over the radio with forced humor. "Fat and slow, easy targets." Several pilots in the formation laughed. After all, Japanese doctrine emphasized speed and agility. Their nimble fighters had torn apart Chinese bombers, outmaneuvered British aircraft, and humiliated American defenders in the war's opening months. Size meant vulnerability. Size meant an easy kill. What Lieutenant Commander Shibata and his fellow pilots didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined as they began their intercept run, was that the Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented more than just another bomber. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial might, operating at a scale the Japanese Empire had never conceived possible. Each of these silver giants carried more explosive tonnage than Shibata's entire squadron could deliver in a month of missions. The bomb bays that looked so inviting from a distance could swallow 20,000 pounds of ordnance, more destructive power than 40 of Japan's standard bombers combined. And unlike every other bomber in the sky, these fortresses could fight back with a weapon system so advanced it turned the hunter into the hunted. As Shibata closed to attack range, 4 remotely controlled gun turrets swiveled toward his aircraft with mechanical precision. The B-29 didn't need to maneuver. It simply pointed its weapons and waited. The laughter on the radio frequency died abruptly, replaced by sharp commands and the staccato burst of cannon fire. What happened in the next 7 minutes would shatter Japanese confidence and herald a new era of strategic bombing, one where a single aircraft type would bring an empire to its knees. To understand the shock Japanese pilots experienced when they first encountered the B-29, we must first examine the state of strategic bombing in late 1944. And the vast technological chasm that separated American and Japanese aviation industries. By November 1944, the Pacific War had been raging for nearly 3 years. Japan's early victories, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, had established a defensive perimeter spanning thousands of miles. Japanese military planners believed this vast ocean barrier would protect the home islands from American retaliation. Even if the United States developed long-range bombers, the distances involved seemed insurmountable. The closest American bases in China were over 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Bases in the Mariana Islands, once captured, would still be 1,500 miles away. No existing bomber could carry a meaningful bomb load over such distances, fight through Japanese air defenses, and return safely. The mathematics of fuel, weight, and range made strategic bombing of Japan theoretically impossible. Or so Japanese planners calculated. Japan's own bomber force reflected this defensive mindset. The Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary land-based attack aircraft, had impressive range, but carried only 1,760 pounds of bombs or a single torpedo. The Army's Ki-49 Helen heavy bomber managed 2,200 pounds maximum. Even Japan's newest designs, rushed into production in 1944, couldn't exceed 4,000 pounds of bomb capacity. These limitations weren't due to lack of engineering skill. Japanese designers produced excellent aircraft within the constraints of their industrial capacity. The problem was fundamental. Japan simply didn't possess the raw materials, manufacturing infrastructure, or electrical power generation to build truly heavy bombers. Consider the industrial comparison. In 1944, the United States produced 96,318 aircraft of all types. Japan manufactured 28,180. American factories consumed 41 million kilowatts of electrical power. Japanese industry operated on 9.4 million kilowatts. The United States produced 80.6 million tons of steel that year. Japan managed 9.7 million tons. This industrial gap translated directly into aircraft capability. American bomber designs didn't need to compromise. They could use powerful engines, heavy armor, multiple defensive weapons, and still carry enormous bomb loads because American industry could produce the required materials and components in virtually unlimited quantities. The B-29 Superfortress embodied this philosophy of overwhelming resource application. Development began in 1940 when the Army Air Forces issued a specification for a hemispheric defense weapon, a bomber that could fly from American territory to attack any target on Earth. The requirements seemed impossible. Range of 5,333 miles. Speed of 400 miles per hour. Ceiling of 35,000 feet. Bomb load of 20,000 pounds. Heavy defensive armament. Pressurized crew compartments. Boeing's design team, led by Chief Engineer Edward Curtis Wells, proposed an aircraft so advanced it required inventing new technologies just to make it flyable. The R-3000 350 Wright Cyclone engine, developing 2,200 horsepower, the most powerful aircraft engine in production. A pressurized cabin system allowing crew comfort at altitudes where unpressurized aircraft crew would lose consciousness. A remote-controlled gun turret system using analog computers to calculate firing solutions. And a wing design incorporating high-lift devices that allowed an aircraft weighing 140,000 pounds to take off from existing runways. The program cost exceeded $3 billion more than the Manhattan Project. Boeing built 3 massive new factories to produce the bombers. Subcontractors across America manufactured millions of components. The first prototype flew on the 21st of September 1942. By late 1944, B-29 seconds were rolling off production lines at the rate of 350 per month. Japanese intelligence officers studying captured documents and wreckage simply couldn't believe the specifications. The numbers had to be propaganda. No aircraft that size could fly at 400 miles per hour. No bomber could operate at 35,000 feet. No defensive system could hit fighters from 1,000 yards away. The Americans were exaggerating to damage Japanese morale. This institutional disbelief would prove catastrophic. When the first B-29 reconnaissance flights appeared over Tokyo in November 1944, Japanese fighter pilots received inadequate briefings, insufficient training, and completely inaccurate tactical guidance. They approached the Superfortresses using techniques developed against B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds aircraft that seemed puny in comparison. Lieutenant Commander Shibata and his squadron represented Japan's best hope. They flew modern fighters, trained rigorously, and possessed combat experience against American aircraft. They understood the basics of high-altitude interception. They knew how to approach bomber formations from blind spots, concentrate fire on engines, and break away before defensive gunners could track them. What they didn't understand, what no amount of training could have prepared them for, was that the B-29 had eliminated traditional bomber vulnerabilities through brute force application of American technology and industrial capacity. The morning of November 24th, 1944, marked a turning point not just in the air war over Japan, but in the psychological calculus of Japanese resistance. What happened in the skies above Tokyo that day would be retold in American military academies for decades and remembered in Japanese aviation circles as the day we realized we had already lost. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata's intercept flight consisted of 12 key 61 Hien fighters, Tony in Allied code names. These were among Japan's finest interceptors, powered by liquid-cooled engines similar to German designs, capable of 380 miles per hour, and armed with 2 20mm cannons and 2 12.7mm machine guns. His squadron had destroyed American B-24 Liberators over the Philippines, shot down Navy fighters in the Solomon Islands, and protected Japanese installations from countless raids. They climbed with confidence, each pilot certain of victory. As they approached the B-29 formation from the rear quarter, the classic attacking position where bomber defensive fire was supposedly weakest, Shibata noticed something peculiar. The Superfortresses weren't performing the defensive maneuvers he expected. They didn't tighten formation. They didn't alter altitude. They simply continued their straight, level approach to Tokyo as if the interceptors didn't exist. "Arrogant Americans," Lieutenant Yamada muttered. "They'll learn." At 1,000 yards distance, Shibata armed his weapons and prepared to attack. Standard doctrine called for closing to 300 yards, firing a concentrated burst into the engines or cockpit, then breaking sharply away to avoid collision and defensive fire. Against B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, this tactic had proven effective. The American gunners couldn't track fast-moving fighters long enough to land killing shots at close range. At 800 yards, something unexpected happened. The tail gunner position of the nearest B-29 rotated with mechanical precision. Unlike the manually aimed guns on other bombers, the turret moved smoothly, tracking Shibata's approach with eerie accuracy. Then the top forward turret swiveled, then both side blisters. Within 2 seconds, 4 separate gun positions had oriented directly toward his fighter. Shibata's training told him this was impossible. Bomber gunners needed time to manually traverse turrets, calculate deflection, and coordinate fire. The B-29's turrets moved as if guided by a single mind, all turning in perfect synchronization. "They're tracking us," he reported, uncertain why this observation filled him with such unease. All guns oriented on our formation. At 600 yards, the B-29 opened fire. The Central Fire Control System, one of the Superfortress's most revolutionary features, used analog computers to calculate range, deflection, ballistic drop, and relative motion. When the gunner in the sighting station acquired a target, the computer automatically aimed whichever turrets had a clear shot, adjusted for the target's speed and direction, and compensated for the bomber's own motion through three-dimensional space. The result was fire accuracy that Japanese pilots had never experienced. 12 50 caliber machine guns, the combined armament of 3 separate turrets, all aimed at Shibata's aircraft, began pouring rounds toward his fighter at a rate of 4,800 bullets per minute. At this range, the converging streams of tracer fire looked like lasers connecting the bomber to his aircraft. "Break! Break!" Shibata shouted, throwing his Key 61 into a desperate spiral. Rounds hammered into his right wing, shredding metal and fabric. His wingman, Lieutenant Yamada, wasn't as fortunate. The concentrated fire from 2 B-29 seconds, over 20 machine guns tracking his aircraft, simultaneously literally tore his fighter apart in midair. The high-end disintegrated into a cloud of debris and flame, the pilot never having a chance to bail out. 11 fighters now remained. The American formation still hadn't altered course. Shibata realized with growing horror that the B-29 seconds weren't evading because they didn't need to evade. They possessed sufficient defensive firepower to destroy attackers before those attackers could get into effective range. The entire tactical equation had been reversed. Interceptors had become the vulnerable targets. "We'll attack from the front," he ordered, banking his damaged fighter to position for a head-on pass. "They can't bring all guns to bear forward." This was tactically sound reasoning. Traditional bombers had limited forward firepower because the cockpit and nose section occupied the space where guns would normally mount. A head-on attack closed the distance quickly, minimized exposure time, and exploited the defensive blind spot. The B-29 had eliminated this vulnerability too. As Shibata's squadron accelerated toward the American formation, the forward dorsal turrets on multiple aircraft rotated 180 degrees. Each turret mounted 4 50 caliber machine guns. As the range closed to 1,200 yards, 6 B-29 seconds opened fire simultaneously, 96 machine guns, creating an interlocking cone of destruction directly in the interceptor's flight path. The mathematics were brutal. The closing speed of a head-on attack meant fighters traveled 600 feet per second. At that velocity, a pilot experienced only 2 seconds of firing time before needing to break away or collide with the bomber. 2 seconds of attacking versus continuous fire from nearly 100 guns. 3 more key 61 seconds exploded or spiraled away trailing smoke. Shibata's aircraft took additional hits in the engine cowling and cockpit canopy. Hydraulic fluid spattered across his windscreen. His number 2 cylinder temperature gauge showed critical overheating. 8 fighters now remained from the original 12. The American formation had lost 0 aircraft and maintained its bombing approach without deviation. "They're not bombers," Shibata transmitted to ground control, his voice tight with pain and realization. "They're flying battleships. Every approach angle is covered. Every position has overlapping fields of fire. We're not fighting aircraft. We're fighting a mobile fortress." His squadron made 3 more attack runs, burning precious fuel and ammunition, achieving nothing except 2 additional aircraft lost and 4 more damaged. The B-29 seconds reached their initial point, turned toward the target, opened their bomb bay doors, and released their ordnance with mechanical precision. Each bomber carried 20,000 pounds of incendiaries, 4,500-pound clusters that would scatter thousands of individual bomblets across Tokyo's densely packed industrial districts. The formation of 111 B-29 seconds dropped 2,220,000 pounds of fire that morning. The resulting conflagration destroyed 16 major factories, killed 2,700 people, and consumed 7 square miles of the city. Shibata nursed his damaged fighter back to Chofu Airfield, landing with failing hydraulics and a seized engine. As ground crew swarmed his aircraft to assess the damage, he sat in the cockpit, hands trembling, staring at the burns on his gloves where hydraulic fluid had splashed through the shattered canopy. The squadron intelligence officer arrived to debrief him. "How many did you shoot down?" he asked, clipboard ready. Shibata laughed a harsh, bitter sound. "Shoot down? We couldn't even get close enough to aim properly. Those machines, they're not like anything we've faced before." "Tell headquarters they need to completely revise our intercept doctrine. Nothing we've trained for works against the B-29. The intelligence officer noted this skeptically. Surely Lieutenant Commander Shibata was exaggerating, shaken by a difficult engagement. American bombers were bombers, large, slow, vulnerable. Every bomber could be shot down with proper tactics and determination. This institutional dismissal of frontline reports would cost Japan dearly, because what Shibata tried to explain wasn't tactical incompetence or bad luck. It was the encounter with an industrial philosophy that Japanese military planners fundamentally couldn't comprehend. When you possess unlimited resources, you don't need to compromise or make clever trade-offs. You simply build everything bigger, heavier, more powerful, and more numerous than the enemy can possibly match. The B-29 Superfortress didn't just outperform Japanese interceptors through superior firepower. It operated within an entirely different technological paradigm, one that leveraged American industrial capacity to eliminate compromises that limited other aircraft designs. To understand why Japanese pilots consistently failed to develop effective countermeasures, we must examine the specific advantages that made the B-29 nearly invulnerable to conventional interception tactics. The most fundamental advantage was operational ceiling. The B-29 cruised comfortably at 30,000 to 35,000 feet altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to operate effectively. Major Yoshio Yoshida, commander of the 244th Fighter Regiment, later recalled the impossible mathematics of high-altitude interception. Our key 61 seconds could reach 32,000 feet, but only in a maximum performance climb that consumed all our fuel. By the time we reached the bomber's altitude, we had perhaps 5 minutes of combat time before needing to descend or run out of fuel entirely. 5 minutes to find the formation, position for attack, make our run, and break away. It was tactical madness. The problem compounded because Japanese fighters' engines lost power dramatically at high altitude. The Ki-61's performance specifications showed a 40% power reduction above 30,000 feet. Maneuverability decreased proportionally. A fighter that could execute a tight turn at 15,000 feet wallowed sluggishly at bomber altitude. Meanwhile, The B-29's four Wright R3350 engines, each equipped with twin General Electric turbochargers, actually increased power output at high altitude. The turbochargers compressed the thin air, maintaining sea-level pressure in the cylinders. At 30,000 feet, where Japanese fighters gasped for air, the Superfortress engines produced 2,200 horsepower each, more than most Japanese fighters' entire engine output at optimal altitude. Captain Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most accomplished air tacticians and a principal planner of the Pearl Harbor attack, studied this problem extensively in late 1944. His classified report to Imperial General Headquarters stated bluntly, "The enemy has solved high-altitude flight through industrial brute force. They do not make their engines more efficient. They simply force more air into the cylinders using compressors that require electrical power equivalent to a small factory. We cannot replicate this approach because we lack the electrical generating capacity to operate such systems at scale." The altitude advantage cascaded into multiple tactical benefits. At 30,000 plus feet, B-29 seconds flew above most weather systems, ensuring consistent bombing accuracy. They operated beyond the effective range of most Japanese anti-aircraft artillery. They could see approaching interceptors from miles away, providing defensive gunners time to track and engage targets before those targets reached firing range. Perhaps the B-29's most revolutionary feature, one that Japanese intelligence officers initially dismissed as propaganda, was the pressurized cabin system. Traditional bombers required crew members to wear heavy, electrically heated flight suits and oxygen masks during high-altitude missions. These suits restricted movement, limited dexterity, and caused fatigue during missions lasting 8 to 12 hours. Frostbite, hypoxia, and exhaustion reduced crew effectiveness, sometimes catastrophically. The B-29 solved this through hermetically sealed crew compartments, maintained at 8,000-foot equivalent pressure, regardless of outside altitude. Crew members worked in shirt sleeves, moved freely, and operated equipment without bulky gloves or masks. The environmental control system maintained comfortable temperatures even when outside air reached -40 degrees Fahrenheit. This might seem like a luxury feature, but the tactical advantages were profound. Alert crew members spotted threats earlier and reacted faster. Bombardiers achieved better accuracy because they could see clearly and manipulate targeting equipment precisely. Gunners tracked targets more smoothly because they weren't fighting hypoxia and frostbite. Mission completion rates increased because crews arrived over target in peak condition rather than exhausted from fighting the environment. Japanese bomber crews, by contrast, suffered terribly during long-range missions. Medical records from Japanese bomber squadrons show that 30–40% of crew members suffered some degree of frostbite or altitude sickness on missions above 25,000 feet, lasting more than 4 hours. Some crews literally froze to death in their aircraft when heating systems failed. The pressurization system also enabled the B-29's remote gun turret concept. Because gunners didn't need to be physically located at their weapons, engineers could position them in the pressurized compartment with computing gun sights, while the turrets themselves occupied aerodynamically optimal positions on the fuselage. The General Electric Central Fire Control (CFC) system represented the most technologically advanced weapon control system installed in any aircraft during World War II. Understanding its capabilities helps explain why Japanese pilots couldn't develop effective attack angles. Traditional bomber defensive armament required each gunner to manually aim their weapon, calculate deflection, the angle needed to hit a moving target, estimate range, and track the target throughout the firing pass. This required exceptional skill, consumed the gunner's full attention, and left coverage gaps when gunners couldn't physically traverse their weapons fast enough to follow maneuvering fighters. The B-29 CFC system replaced this manual process with analog computing. Each gunner position contained a Mark X-10 computing gun sight connected to a gyroscopic fire control computer. When the gunner placed his reticle on an attacking fighter, the computer measured the target's angular velocity using gyroscopes, calculated range using optical rangefinding, determined deflection angle accounting for bullet ballistic trajectory, compensated for the bomber's own speed and direction, selected which turrets had clear shots at the target, automatically aimed those turrets with electrical servo motors, calculated the firing lead angle, and commanded all selected turrets to fire simultaneously. This happened in real time, continuously, for multiple targets. The system's sophistication shocked Japanese technical intelligence when they examined recovered wreckage. Senior engineer Tomokazu Fukaya of the Yokosuka Naval Technical Arsenal submitted a report stating, "The American fire control system employs mathematical principles we understand, but manufacturing precision we cannot duplicate. The gyroscopic computers require tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. The electrical servo motors demand copper wiring purity beyond our refining capability. The optical rangefinders use glass lenses ground to specifications that would require years to achieve with our equipment. We are examining not just advanced engineering, but an entirely different level of industrial capability." For Japanese pilots, the CFC system meant that approaching a B-29 from any angle resulted in multiple turrets tracking their aircraft simultaneously. The bomber didn't need to maneuver defensively, it simply kept up continuous, accurate fire from whatever guns could bear on the target. Sergeant Takeshi Maeda, a rare survivor of multiple B-29 intercept missions, described the experience. "You cannot find a blind spot, because there is no blind spot. The tail guns cover the rear. The dorsal turrets cover above and sides. The ventral turret covers below. And they all move together, tracking you before you even begin your attack run. It's like fighting a machine that can see in all directions simultaneously and never misses." Some pilots simply broke off attacks out of terror, unable to force themselves to fly into that cone of fire. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese pilots training for B-29 interception reported that veteran pilots would describe the experience in terms usually reserved for naval engagements: assaulting a battleship rather than attacking a pressed bomber. The B-29's performance envelope provided strategic flexibility that Japanese defenders couldn't counter. Maximum speed of 365 miles per hour and up to 400 miles per hour in slight dives meant interceptors had extremely limited time to position for attacks. Japanese fighters needed to climb to intercept altitude, locate the bomber stream, position for an attack run, and complete their pass all within the narrow window before the B-29 seconds crossed the target and returned to sea. Colonel Takeo Yamaguchi, commander of air defense for the Tokyo region, calculated that interceptors had an average of 12 to 15 minutes from initial radar detection to bombs away. Subtract the climb time to altitude 8 to 10 minutes for most Japanese fighters, and pilots had perhaps 5 minutes for actual combat. One attack run consumed 2 to 3 minutes, start to finish. Most squadrons only managed 1 or 2 passes before the bombers completed their mission and escaped. The range advantage was equally problematic. B-29 seconds based in the Mariana Islands could reach any target in Japan, drop their bombs, and return home a round trip of 3,000 plus miles. Japanese fighters had combat radiuses of 300 to 400 miles. They couldn't pursue bombers far from base without running out of fuel. This created an asymmetric engagement dynamic. American bombers chose when and where to attack. Japanese defenders had to maintain alert status constantly, burning fuel and pilot energy on false alarms and fruitless patrols. The Americans fought on their schedule. The Japanese reacted on a timeline they couldn't control. One aspect of B-29 operations that Japanese pilots rarely understood was the electronic warfare suite that accompanied bomber missions. American formations included B-29 seconds, specially equipped with radar jamming equipment, the forerunners of modern electronic warfare aircraft. These Ferret bombers transmitted powerful radio signals on frequencies used by Japanese radar and communication systems, creating noise that masked the incoming bomber stream or provided false position information. Japanese radar operators would see formations that weren't there, estimate altitudes incorrectly, or lose track of the bombers entirely as jamming obscured their screens. Fighter controllers vectoring interceptors toward the formations would issue directions based on corrupted information, sending squadrons to wrong altitudes or intercept points where no bombers appeared. Lieutenant Takashi Miyazaki, a radar operator at the Matsudo Air Defense Site, described his frustration. Some nights, we would track a formation for 20 minutes, guiding our fighters toward intercept, only to have the signals vanish or suddenly appear in a completely different location. We couldn't tell if our equipment was malfunctioning, if the Americans had developed some new evasion technique, or if we were seeing ghost echoes. the uncertainty was worse than having no radar at all. The electronic warfare campaign extended beyond jamming. American submarines and aircraft dropped small strips of aluminum foil, later called chaff or window, that created thousands of false radar returns, swamping Japanese radar operators with meaningless data. All of these advantages, altitude, pressurization, fire control, speed, range, and electronic warfare, operated synergistically. They didn't just add to one another, they multiplied. A high-altitude bomber was difficult to intercept. A high-altitude bomber with sophisticated defensive armament was very difficult to intercept. A high-altitude, heavily armed bomber that could jam radar and outrun pursuit was nearly impossible to intercept. And America was producing them at a rate of 350 per month. The true horror for Japanese military planners wasn't just that the B-29 was technologically superior. It was that America could produce these incredibly complex machines in industrial quantities that defied Japanese comprehension. Understanding this production scale requires examining the industrial mobilization that made the B-29 program possible and comparing it to Japan's increasingly desperate manufacturing situation by late 1944. Boeing operated 3 massive production facilities dedicated solely to B-29 manufacture. The Wichita plant in Kansas, covering 4.2 million square feet, employed 30,000 workers and produced 1 B-29 every 4 days at peak production. The Renton plant in Washington State, 1.1 million square feet, manufactured B-29 seconds, alongside other aircraft models, completing 1 Superfortress every 6 days. The joint Boeing-Bell Martin Modification Center in Marietta, Georgia, covered 4 million square feet and finalized aircraft from multiple assembly lines. But these primary facilities represented only the visible tip of an enormous industrial iceberg. The B-29 contained 55,000 separate parts manufactured by over 1,500 subcontractors across the United States. The Wright R-3350 engines came from plants in Ohio. The turrets were manufactured by General Electric in multiple locations. The bomb sights were produced by specialized optical companies. The aluminum came from smelters powered by hydroelectric dams built specifically to support aircraft production. Japanese intelligence analyst Major Takashi Mori attempted to calculate the industrial capacity required for B-29 production. His classified report, discovered in Japanese archives after the war, contained these observations. According to our estimates, a single B-29 requires 70,000 pounds of aluminum, 15,000 pounds of steel alloys, 2,800 pounds of copper, 600 pounds of rubber, and materials we cannot even identify. The Americans claim production of 350 aircraft per month. If accurate, this implies monthly consumption of 24.5 million pounds of aluminum, more than Japan's entire annual production. 5.25 million pounds of steel alloys, 980,000 pounds of copper, 210,000 pounds of rubber. These numbers cannot be reconciled with our understanding of American industrial capacity. Either their production claims are propaganda, or we have fundamentally underestimated their manufacturing capabilities. I fear it is the latter. Major Mori's fears were entirely justified. By late 1944, the United States had achieved industrial output that exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American factories operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They consumed electrical power at rates that would have overloaded Japan's entire national grid. They employed production techniques, assembly lines, interchangeable parts, statistical quality control that Japanese industry was only beginning to understand. The psychological impact of this production differential was profound. Japanese pilots who survived B-29 intercepts described feelings of futility. They could shoot down individual bombers sometimes, but the next raid would contain just as many aircraft, or more. American losses were replaced within days. Japanese losses might never be replaced due to chronic shortages of aluminum, engines, and fuel. By war's end, Boeing, Bell, Martin, and associated contractors had produced 3,970 B-29 seconds. This represented 275 million pounds of aluminum, 60 million pounds of steel, 11 million pounds of copper, 2.4 million pounds of rubber, 15,880 right R, 3,350 engines, 47,640 50 caliber machine guns, 318,400 electrical subsystems. For comparison, Japan's total aircraft production in 1945 was 8,263 aircraft of all types, most of them simple fighters. The B-29 program alone consumed more strategic materials than Japan's entire 1,945 military industrial output. But raw numbers only tell part of the story. The quality differential was equally important. Japanese aircraft in 1944 to 1945 showed declining quality due to material shortages, inexperienced workers replacing conscripted veterans, and Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities. Engines failed frequently. Guns jammed. Control surfaces separated in flight. Some Japanese fighters had such poor quality control that pilots refused to fly them, preferring to wait for less dangerous aircraft. Meanwhile, American quality control improved throughout the war. Boeing implemented statistical sampling, X-ray inspection of welds, and pressure testing of all pressurized components. The rejection rate for B-29 parts was approximately 2%, meaning 98% of manufactured components met specifications on first inspection. This level of precision would have been impossible in Japanese factories struggling with worn tooling, inadequate power supplies, and workers suffering from malnutrition. Aircraft alone don't win wars. Trained crews operating those aircraft determine victory or defeat. Here again, the industrial comparison was devastating for Japan. Each B-29 crew consisted of 11 men: pilot and co-pilot officers, navigator officer, bombardier officer, flight engineer, radio operator, radar operator, 4 gunners. Training a B-29 crew required 8 to 12 months and cost approximately $1 million in 1944 dollars. Pilots accumulated 400-plus flight hours before deploying to combat. Bombardiers trained with Norden bomb sights using the same model they'd use in combat. Gunners practiced on full-scale gun turret simulators that replicated combat conditions. Flight engineers learned every system on the aircraft through detailed technical courses. By comparison, Japanese pilot training by late 1944 had collapsed to 100 to 150 hours, barely enough to safely operate the aircraft, let alone develop combat effectiveness. Bombardier training was minimal or non-existent. Gunner training consisted of firing a few practice rounds at ground targets. The United States trained B-29 crews at multiple dedicated facilities: Randolph Field, Texas Basic Flight Training; Smoky Hill Army Airfield, Kansas B-29 Transition Training; Walker Army Airfield, Kansas Crew Coordination and Tactics; Alamogordo Army Airfield, New Mexico, High Altitude Operations; Cuban Special Weapons Training Sites; Atomic Bomb Crews. These facilities operated continuously, churning out replacement crews faster than combat losses could deplete the trained pool. By war's end, the United States had trained crews for over 4,000 B-29 seconds more aircraft than actually existed, ensuring abundant replacements for combat losses and crew fatigue. Japan, meanwhile, was scraping together barely trained replacement pilots for whatever aircraft remained flyable. The asymmetry was total. Even if Japan had somehow manufactured B-29 equivalent aircraft, they couldn't have operated them effectively due to fuel shortages. Each B-29 mission consumed approximately 7,000 gallons of aviation gasoline high-octane fuel requiring sophisticated refining. A typical rate of 300 B-29 seconds consumed 2.1 million gallons of avgas. American petroleum production in 1,944. 1.6 billion barrels per year, 67 billion gallons. Japanese petroleum production in 1,944. 7 million barrels per year, 294 million gallons, mostly crude oil, requiring refining. The Americans consumed more aviation gasoline in a single month of B-29 operations than Japan produced in an entire year of maximum effort petroleum extraction and refining. This fuel differential crippled Japanese air defense. By early 1945, Japanese fighters sat grounded for lack of aviation fuel, while B-29 seconds overhead burned gasoline at rates that would have fueled Japan's entire military for weeks. Colonel Takeo Yamaguchi, commander of Tokyo Air Defense, noted bitterly in his diary, "We have aircraft, we have pilots, we have ammunition, but we have no fuel." American bombers approach, and our interceptors sit idle, their tanks dry, while the enemy above burns more fuel in one raid than we will see in the next month. We are not fighting a war of tactics anymore. We are fighting a war of industrial capacity, and we lost that war before it even began. Perhaps the most psychologically crushing aspect of American industrial capacity was the replacement rate. When Japanese pilots successfully shot down a B-29, a difficult and dangerous achievement, they knew the Americans would replace it within days. The Boeing production system functioned so efficiently that aircraft destroyed over Tokyo on Tuesday could be replaced by Friday. Japanese aircraft losses, by contrast, might never be replaced. By 1945, Japan's aluminum production had declined to the point where manufacturing a single fighter required scrapping or recycling 2 or 3 damaged aircraft. Engines were rebuilt multiple times until they literally fell apart. Spare parts became so scarce that maintenance crews cannibalized crashed aircraft for components. The psychological burden of fighting an enemy who possessed unlimited resources while your own side operated on starvation rations cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots flew mission after mission, watching comrades die, knowing their sacrifices achieved nothing permanent because American industry simply produced more bombers, more crews, more fuel, more bombs. Sergeant Takeshi Maeda, after surviving his 7th B-29 intercept mission, recorded in his diary, "We are not fighting the American military. We are fighting American factories. Every B-29 we destroy represents perhaps 1 day of production from their assembly lines. They lose 1 bomber and simply build another. We lose 1 fighter and pray we can repair it before the next raid. This is not warfare. This is an industrial extermination." This realization that Japan was fighting not an enemy military, but an industrial complex that could not be defeated through tactical excellence or warrior spirit, shattered the psychological foundation of Japanese resistance. The B-29 became not just a weapon, but a symbol of American industrial supremacy, operating at a scale the Japanese Empire could not comprehend, let alone match. By early 1945, the appearance of B-29 seconds over Japan had transformed from a military threat into an existential terror that eroded Japanese morale across all levels of society. The psychological impact went far beyond the physical destruction. Japanese citizens and military personnel alike were witnessing the systematic, unstoppable demolition of their nation by an enemy who operated with such overwhelming superiority that resistance seemed pointless. The B-29's engines produced a distinctive sound, a deep, droning rumble that carried for miles. Unlike the higher-pitched noise of fighters or medium bombers, the Superfortress's 4 Wright R3000 350 seconds created a low-frequency resonance that Japanese civilians described as the sound of doom. Hatsuyo Nakamura, a civilian survivor of the Tokyo firebombing, later recalled, "You could hear them coming for 10-15 minutes before they arrived. That sound, it was like thunder that never stopped, getting louder and louder. Children would start crying when they heard it. Adults would freeze, unable to move. We knew air raid shelters were useless against what was coming. The sound itself became a weapon more terrible than the bombs." The psychological toll of this auditory warning created a phenomenon military psychologists would later study extensively. Knowing destruction was approaching, but being unable to prevent it, induced a form of learned helplessness. People stopped going to shelters. They stopped attempting evacuation. They simply waited for the inevitable. For Japanese fighter pilots, the psychological burden was different, but equally crushing. These were men trained in the warrior tradition, taught that skill and determination could overcome any obstacle. The B-29 challenged this fundamental belief. Captain Yasuhiko Kuroi, commander of the 302nd Fighter Squadron, kept a journal throughout 1945 that provides haunting insight into the collapse of pilot morale. The 15th of January, 1945. We intercepted a formation of B-29 seconds today. Lost 3 aircraft. Damaged 2 bombers. Possibly. They continued to their target as if we hadn't attacked them at all. The 8th of February, 1945. Another raid. Another 3 pilots dead. I have stopped learning the new pilots' names. They last 2, maybe 3 missions before death or injury removes them. What is the point of remembering names when the people disappear so quickly? The 4th of March, 1945. I shot down a B-29 today. Confirmed. I watched it spiral into Tokyo Bay. Trailing fire. I felt nothing. No pride. No satisfaction. Because I know that tomorrow, or the next day, there will be 3 more to replace the one I destroyed. We are not fighting a war anymore. We are participating in our own execution. The 12th of April, 1945, we received orders to ram B-29 seconds if we run out of ammunition. The commanders call this special attack, as if deliberately killing ourselves is some kind of tactical innovation, rather than an admission that we have no other options left. I have agreed to lead the ramming attacks. Not because I believe we can win, but because dying quickly seems preferable to this slow realization of our complete helplessness. This progression from confidence to desperation to suicidal resignation appeared across Japanese fighter units. The B-29 didn't just destroy aircraft and infrastructure, it destroyed the psychological foundation of Japanese military resistance. In spring 1945, Japanese commanders institutionalized kamikaze tactics specifically targeting B-29 seconds. The Shinton Special Attack Units trained pilots to deliberately ram superfortresses, hoping the fighters' momentum would cause catastrophic damage. The mathematics of ramming attacks revealed the depth of Japanese desperation. A successful ram required the fighter pilot to 1. Climb to bomber altitude, consuming nearly all fuel. 2. Position ahead of the formation, extremely difficult, given B-29 speed. 3. Turn into the bomber stream and aim for a specific aircraft. 4. Maintain collision course despite defensive fire from multiple turrets. 5. Impact with sufficient force to cause critical damage. Success rate was approximately 5 to 7%. For every 100 ramming attempts, 93 to 95 pilots died without achieving their objective. The survivors often crashed due to damage sustained before impact or lack of fuel to return to base. Lieutenant Hajime Toyoshima, one of the few pilots to survive a ramming attempt, described the experience. I approached from the front, diving slightly to build speed. Their guns opened fire at 1,200 yards. I saw the tracers coming toward me like chains of light. My aircraft was hit perhaps 50 times before I reached the bomber. My windscreen shattered. My engine began trailing smoke. I struck the B-29's left wing with my propeller, and the impact threw my fighter into a spin. I somehow recovered and crash-landed in a rice paddy. When they pulled me from the wreck, the maintenance crew counted over 200 bullet holes in my aircraft. The B-29 I struck, I learned later it returned to base safely. The damage I inflicted that I died trying to inflict was superficial. They patched the wing, and the aircraft flew again 2 days later. That's when I understood we had already lost. A pilot could sacrifice everything, achieve a perfect ramming attack, and the result would be nothing. The Americans would repair the damage or replace the aircraft and continue bombing us. We were throwing lives away for no purpose except delaying the inevitable by hours or days. The B-29 raid's psychological impact extended beyond military personnel to affect civilian morale fundamentally. By March 1945, Tokyo had been bombed repeatedly. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, every major Japanese city experienced regular B-29 raids. The precision and consistency of these attacks created a sense of inevitable doom. What made the psychological burden particularly crushing was the asymmetry of suffering. Japanese civilians could see the B-29 seconds overhead, silver in the sunlight, flying in perfect formations, untouchable. They could see Japanese fighters attempting interception, watching them get shot down or driven off. The visual confirmation of helplessness was devastating. Dr. Tatsuo Koizumi, a physician working in Tokyo throughout 1945, observed the psychological breakdown. I treated many patients for what we would now call post-traumatic stress. But the symptoms were different from combat trauma. These patients weren't responding to a single terrifying event. They were responding to the certainty of future destruction. People knew the bombers would return. They knew air defenses couldn't stop them. They knew their homes would eventually burn. The knowledge of inevitable future suffering, the inability to escape or prevent it, created a psychological state I had never encountered before. Patients described it as drowning in slow motion, watching the water rise, unable to move, waiting for the end. Some simply gave up. They stopped seeking shelter during raids. They went about their daily activities while bombs fell, as if they had decided that acceptance was less painful than prolonged terror. I saw mothers continue preparing meals while their houses burned, fathers reading newspapers while incendiaries landed in their gardens. The mind cannot sustain panic indefinitely. Eventually, it surrenders to fate. Japanese government propaganda attempted to maintain morale by emphasizing heroic resistance and minimizing American effectiveness. These efforts backfired catastrophically because civilians could verify the lies with their own eyes. When propaganda broadcasts claimed Japanese fighters were destroying American bomber formations, civilians could look up and see undamaged B-29 seconds continuing to their targets. When newspapers reported significant damage inflicted on enemy aircraft, the next day's raid contained just as many bombers or more. This credibility gap destroyed trust in government communications entirely. If the authorities lied about battlefield results, what else were they lying about? Food rations? War progress? Conditions for soldiers overseas? The realization that the government had been systematically deceiving the public eroded the social cohesion necessary for total war mobilization. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the B-29 campaign was when Japanese military leaders themselves, in internal communications, began admitting the situation was hopeless. Admiral Matomi Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, wrote in his diary after a particularly devastating B-29 raid on Kure Naval Arsenal. The 30th of April, 1945. The enemy bombers approached at high altitude this afternoon. Our interceptors attempted engagement, but achieved no results. The bombers dropped their ordnance with precision and departed without loss. They weren't even hurried. They flew in perfect formation, bombed their targets accurately, and left as if they were conducting a training exercise rather than penetrating our most heavily defended airspace. I watched from headquarters with my staff. No one spoke. What could we say? That our pilots were cowards? They attempted intercept and were shot down or driven off. That our anti-aircraft gunners were incompetent? They fired thousands of rounds and hit nothing at that altitude. That our strategy was flawed? What strategy can defeat an enemy who possesses such overwhelming industrial and technological superiority? The truth none of us want to acknowledge is that we lost this war the moment American industry fully mobilized. The B-29 is not just an aircraft. It is a symbol of their capacity to manufacture the tools of war faster than we can destroy them. We are fighting a futile battle against an enemy that possesses infinite resources, infinite replacements, infinite patience. They will continue bombing us until nothing remains, and there is nothing we can do to prevent it. This admission from a senior military commander responsible for air defense reflected the complete psychological collapse of Japanese military leadership. They understood intellectually that continuing the war was pointless, but the code of Bushido demanded they fight to the death regardless of practical outcomes. The psychological impact of the B-29 campaign culminated in 2 missions that shattered any remaining Japanese will to resist. On March 9–10, 1945, 334B, 29 seconds, firebombed Tokyo, killing over 100,000 people in a single night, the single most destructive air raid in human history. The psychological trauma from this raid extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Survivors described a landscape of total destruction where entire neighborhoods had vanished, replaced by ash and rubble. Then, on August 6 and 9, 1945, 2B, 29 seconds, the Enola Gay and Boxcar delivered atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world had never seen weapons of this magnitude. Cities that had taken centuries to build disappeared in seconds. The The psychological message was unmistakable. American industrial capacity had advanced beyond conventional warfare into realms that seemed almost supernatural. They had built weapons that made traditional military resistance meaningless. Continuing the war meant national extermination. Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech on the 15th of August 1945 explicitly referenced the atomic bombs as justification for ending the war. But in truth, the psychological defeat had occurred months earlier. The B-29 conventional bombing campaign had already demonstrated that Japan could not defend itself, could not strike back effectively, and could not prevent the systematic destruction of its industrial capacity and urban centers. The atomic bombs were merely the final punctuation on a sentence the B-29 raids had been writing since November 1944. American industrial supremacy made Japanese victory impossible and continued resistance pointless. The decades following World War II provided extensive documentation validating the B-29's revolutionary impact not just on the Pacific War's outcome, but on the entire subsequent history of strategic aviation. After the war, American military historians interviewed hundreds of Japanese military personnel to understand their perspective on the B-29 campaign. These interviews, preserved in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey archives, provide remarkable insights. General Takejiro Onishi, a principal architect of Japanese air defense strategy, submitted a written analysis in October 1945 that included this assessment. The B-29 represented not merely superior technology, but an entirely different philosophy of warfare. Japanese military tradition emphasized the warrior's skill, determination, and willingness to sacrifice. We believed these virtues could overcome material disadvantages. The B-29 demonstrated that when the material disadvantage reaches a certain threshold, no amount of skill or determination matters. American strategy with the B-29 was essentially industrial warfare. They built aircraft we could not match, in quantities we could not counter, operated by crews trained to standards we could not achieve, consuming resources we could not provide. They did not need tactical brilliance. They simply needed to maintain industrial production, and their victory was inevitable. This is the lesson we failed to learn until too late. Modern warfare is fundamentally industrial warfare. The nation with superior manufacturing capacity, resource extraction, and technological innovation will always defeat the nation, relying on warrior spirit alone. This is a bitter truth for those of us raised in samurai tradition, but it is nonetheless truth. This admission from a general who had dedicated his life to Japanese military aviation validated everything American strategic planners had believed about industrial warfare's decisive importance. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted in 1945 to 1946, provided comprehensive data on the B-29 campaign's effectiveness. Total B-29 sorties, flown 34,790. Total bomb tonnage dropped 171,000 tons. Japanese industrial production decline 67%. From peak 1,944 levels to surrender. Urban area destroyed 178 square miles across 67 cities. Estimated casualties 330,000 killed, 476,000 wounded. But beyond raw numbers, the survey's psychological assessment proved most telling. The B-29 bombing campaign achieved strategic effects disproportionate to the physical destruction inflicted. While only 25% of Japanese industrial capacity was directly destroyed by bombing, overall production declined by 67% due to evacuation of workers from cities, diversion of resources to air defense, psychological impact on remaining workforce, disruption of transportation networks, forced dispersion of manufacturing to less efficient locations. The psychological impact proved more decisive than physical destruction. Japanese civilians and military personnel alike developed a sense of hopelessness and inevitability regarding defeat. This psychological collapse preceded and facilitated the final military collapse. Today, multiple B-29 seconds have been restored to flying or display condition, allowing new generations to appreciate the aircraft's scale and complexity. Fifi, operated by the Commemorative Air Force, is one of only 2 airworthy B-29 seconds remaining. Crew Chief Randy Wilson, who maintains the aircraft, notes, "Even by modern standards, the B-29 is an impressive machine." The pressurization system, the remote gun turrets, the analog fire control computers, these were revolutionary in 1944, and they're still sophisticated today. Modern aircraft use digital computers where the B-29 used mechanical computers, but the fundamental principles remain the same. What really impresses visitors is the size. People read the specifications: 141-foot wingspan, 99-foot length, 140,000 pounds loaded weight, and they think they understand. Then they stand next to the aircraft and realize those numbers don't convey the scale. This thing is massive, and the Americans built 4,000 of them in factories that didn't exist before the war, using techniques that hadn't been invented yet. The industrial achievement is almost more impressive than the aircraft itself. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Ohio displays Boxcar, the B-29, that dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Museum curator Rob Bardua explains, "Visitors come to see the aircraft that dropped the atomic bomb. But what they often don't understand is that Boxcar was essentially identical to thousands of other B-29 seconds. It wasn't a special aircraft built for a unique mission. It was a standard Superfortress that happened to be assigned the atomic mission. That's what made the B-29 so terrifying for Japan. These weren't rare super weapons. They were mass-produced bombers, rolling off assembly lines by the hundreds every month. Any one of them could carry enough conventional explosives to flatten a neighborhood. 2 of them could carry weapons that vaporized entire cities. The scalability of American industrial might was the true weapon, not any individual aircraft. The B-29's technological innovations influenced aircraft design for decades. Pressurized cabins became standard on all large aircraft, from military transports to commercial airliners. The Boeing 707, 737, 747. Every modern airliner traces its pressurization system directly back to the B-29's pioneering design. Remote-controlled weapon systems evolved into the computer-guided armament systems on modern military aircraft. Every fighter, bomber, and attack helicopter employing remote or automated weapon systems owes a technological debt to the B-29's central fire control system. Even the project management techniques developed for B-29 production influenced post-war manufacturing. The assembly line coordination, subcontractor management, and quality control systems Boeing pioneered during the war became standard practice across American industry. The B-29's influence extended directly into the Cold War strategic balance. The Soviet Union, recognizing the strategic importance of long-range bombers, copied the B-29 design after 3 superfortresses made emergency landings in Soviet territory in 1944. The resulting Tupolev Tu-4 was a virtually exact duplicate, reverse-engineered from American aircraft. This Soviet bomber fleet, based entirely on captured B-29 technology, became the foundation of their early nuclear deterrent. The aircraft that terrified Japan also ensured mutual assured destruction during the early Cold War, influencing superpower relations for decades. Reunions between American B-29 crews and Japanese fighter pilots who opposed them provided profound moments of reconciliation and mutual respect. In 1995, at a 50th anniversary commemoration in Tokyo, retired Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata, the pilot from our opening scene, met Colonel Paul Tibbets, who commanded the Enola Gay atomic mission. Their conversation, recorded by NHK television, was remarkably frank. "When we first saw your B-29 seconds, we thought they were simply large, slow targets. We were trained to believe that Japanese skill and spirit could overcome American material advantages. We were catastrophically wrong." You weren't wrong about the skill part. Japanese pilots were excellent, especially early in the war. But the B-29 was designed specifically to make pilot skill less relevant. We built a machine that could win through technological superiority rather than requiring exceptional crews. That was the lesson that broke us psychologically, realizing that our best efforts didn't matter because you had built a system that eliminated the advantages we relied upon. It was like fighting an opponent who changed the rules of combat to make all your training obsolete. Tibbets, that was exactly our strategy. We knew we couldn't match Japanese pilots in turning dogfights, so we built aircraft that didn't need to dogfight. We operated at altitudes where you couldn't follow effectively. We armed defensively so heavily that attacking was suicidal. We produced so many bombers that shooting down individuals didn't change the strategic outcome. We made it a war of industrial capacity instead of warrior skill. And you won decisively. I tell younger Japanese military officers now, never forget that lesson. Modern warfare is industrial warfare. The nation with superior technology and production capacity will always defeat the nation relying only on bravery and training. This conversation encapsulated the B-29's historical significance. It wasn't just a weapon, but a demonstration of how industrial capacity applied to warfare could overcome traditional military virtues. The Yasukuni Museum in Tokyo, controversial for other reasons, maintains an exhibit on the B-29 campaign that includes testimony from Japanese pilots and civilians. One display features a quote from Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind Pearl Harbor's planning. "We awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. But we didn't just wake him, we gave him time to build weapons we couldn't match." The B-29 represented American industrial might fully mobilized. Every time we saw those silver bombers overhead, we were seeing our own defeat written in aluminum and fire. They didn't just bomb our cities. They bombed our hope, our confidence, our belief that we could win. The physical destruction was terrible, but the psychological destruction was complete. This acknowledgement from one of Japan's most respected military minds validated the B-29's strategic impact beyond its physical destructive capability. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress stands as one of history's most significant weapons, not because it was the deadliest, though it was devastating, but because it represented a fundamental shift in how wars are fought and won. When Lieutenant Commander Shibata and his squadron encountered those silver bombers on the 24th of November 1944, they weren't just facing a new aircraft. They were confronting the reality that modern warfare had evolved beyond the battlefield skills they had spent years mastering. The B-29 made traditional fighter pilot excellence largely irrelevant through the simple application of overwhelming industrial capacity. The lessons extend far beyond World War II. Superior training cannot overcome technological disadvantages beyond a certain threshold. Industrial capacity, the ability to manufacture, deploy, and sustain advanced weapon systems, determines modern warfare outcomes more than battlefield tactics. Psychological effects of technological superiority can exceed physical destruction, breaking enemy will to resist before military capacity is eliminated. These principles, demonstrated so dramatically by the B-29 campaign, shaped Cold War strategy, influenced modern military procurement, and continue to define great power competition today. The final statistics tell a stark story. 3,970 B-29 seconds produced, 34,790 combat sorties flown, 171,000 tons of bombs dropped, 414 aircraft lost to all causes, 2% loss rate, 178 square miles of Japanese cities destroyed, thousands of Japanese fighters destroyed or damaged attempting interception. But beyond statistics, the B-29 campaign represented something more profound. The demonstration that a nation possessing sufficient industrial capacity, technological innovation, and resource abundance could build weapons that made traditional military resistance futile. Japanese pilots laughed when they first saw the B-29's enormous size. They stopped laughing when they realized that one bomber carried more destructive power than their entire squadron. They stopped fighting when they understood that American factories would produce these aircraft faster than Japanese pilots could shoot them down. In the end, the B-29 didn't just help win World War II. It redefined what winning meant in modern warfare. Victory no longer belonged to the side with the most skilled warriors or the most courageous soldiers. Victory belonged to the side that could mobilize industrial capacity to manufacture technological superiority at a scale the enemy couldn't match. That lesson written in fire across Japanese skies by silver bombers operating at altitudes defenders couldn't reach, remains relevant today. The nation that controls advanced manufacturing, maintains technological innovation, and possesses the industrial capacity to mass-produce sophisticated weapon systems will dominate modern conflict regardless of enemy determination or tactical skill. The B-29 proved this principle decisively. The Japanese pilots who laughed at its size learned this truth the hardest way possible, by watching their nation systematically destroyed by a weapon they couldn't stop, couldn't match, and couldn't even meaningfully oppose. Their laughter died over Tokyo in November 1944. The silence that followed echoed through the remainder of the war and beyond, a testament to industrial warfare's terrible efficiency.